Okay.
I could edit that out later.
Welcome to History Tidbit number 17, Flying in the Chilkat Valley. My name is Helen Alten, and I am the director of the Haines Sheldon Museum. Air travel is an important way that we stay connected to the outside world. We've seen various commuter airlines land and take off at our Haines airfield since it was built in 1941. Recently, this included Wings of Alaska, Alaska Seaplanes, and, briefly, Harris Air. For the purposes of this talk, we are going to focus on air travel in the Chilkat Valley from the 1920s through the mid-1960s, as illustrated with photos and objects from our Haines Sheldon Museum collection. So sit back, relax, and get ready for takeoff. Let's dive into some aviation history in the Chilkat Valley. This is our first image of an airplane in the Haines area in the Chilkat Valley. And for the purposes of this talk, we're starting in the 1920s, and for rural Alaska, the airplane's arrival during the 1920s was a revelation. Our earliest information about airplanes in Haines comes from this 1923 photograph and from a Sheldon family narrative. This photograph shows a circling biplane with the Chilkoot Range visible behind it. A note in our database states that this plane charged passengers $5 for an aerial sightseeing tour of Chilkoot Barracks, and $5 is equivalent to $75 today. The Wright brothers, who invented airplanes in 1903, and biplanes, which traveled at about 80 miles per hour, were used in World War I. But it was the 1920s when airplanes took off. Designs improved significantly, making them more reliable and capable of longer distances, and also heavier loads. The decade is marked by the prevalence of planes for entertainment value, people paying to ride in them or watching barnstormers perform aerial acrobatics. So this man who came up with this plane and charged people to go in it was a very common sight, or a relatively common sight. It was an exciting thing to do, to go up in a plane. Steve Sheldon took a flight-seeing tour of Haines in an open cockpit pontoon plane in 1924, and it was his first time flying. Now, in 1929, the whole family went up in a plane. This plane landed in the bay below the Sheldon house 5 years later in 1929, and the 4 children took the opportunity to go up for a ride. This is the first of 2 photos from this trip, and you see they're sitting there on the beach waiting, and then this is a picture of the plane at the beach coming up to the shore. And the image negatives are labeled First Family Flight and dated 1929. Now, Mrs. Sheldon was petrified of planes and boats, and she had to fly in the late 30s a sick friend to Juneau. She flew home and remarked, "I'll fly back and forth now. I'd rather be scared 40 minutes than 8 hours anytime." So her feeling was, if it was a choice between a boat and a plane at least was a faster way to get through the terror. The 1930s were a tumultuous time when Alaska's small airlines formed, failed, or merged. Local airline companies such as Alaska Air Transport, based in Juneau, and Ellis Air, based in Ketchikan, and national airline companies such as Pan American Airways, subsidiary Pacific Alaska Airways, expanded their Alaska service. During these early years, pilots flew rescues, mercy missions, and had adventuresome trips that built the bush pilot legends. Flying wasn't scheduled. You typically flew once the plane was full, whether it was full of passengers, furs, or groceries. And that's still true to some extent today. For some of us, I have flown on planes and arrived places to find that my next flight had been totally changed, and I had to wait until they got enough people or enough goods to continue flying on the float plane. So Alaska all of us who live here know that sometimes you just kind of wait to see what's happening. In 1932, there were 31 planes in Alaska. By 1936, the number had doubled to 71. And by then, 30% of all freight carried within Alaska was moved by air. Until a runway was constructed here in the Chilkat Valley, pontoon planes, such as the one pictured here, and there's another one on this next one, and this is a pontoon plane in 1937, and Grumman Goose planes, which are belly landers, landed in the water in Portage Cove in front of Fort Seward. And this photo, which is titled Juneau Plane at Haines, Alaska, was taken in 1937, and it shows this pontoon plane landing at in the water. And basically this area here is where the small boat harbor is. Over here is where the museum is. Prominently seen are the two Haines mission buildings, which were Haines House and Wheeler Hall, and they're connected by a passageway. And this is as I said, the museum is up here, and Main Street is all along here. The belly landing Grumman Goose was an 8-passenger amphibious aircraft. And this is an image of a Grumman Goose at Portage Cove. And Portage Cove is, we also call that the small boat harbor or the cruise ship dock. That's all part of Portage Cove. The Grumman Goose was first produced in 1937, and it quickly became the preferred plane for use by Southeast Airlines after World War II. Very versatile plane. It landed on land, it landed on water, and it was very popular for transport in Southeast Alaska. I have heard a story, not here in Haines, but in Ketchikan. A friend of mine, when he was a young boy, flew into Ketchikan and the plane flipped. And so he always had sort of a terror of small planes. They all got out and everybody was fine, but it was kind of a rocky plane. At Haines, there were no floats or turnarounds for the planes, as there were in other small towns. So in our situation, the agent had a pair of waist-high waders and carried each passenger to or from the plane. And this image of a passenger embarking from an Alaska Coastal Airlines plane in Haines shows the standard process of loading and unloading planes at Portage Cove, where the small boat harbor is now located. This image is from the Schnabel family album and was donated by Deborah Schnabel. The Alaska Coastal Airlines, ACA, was formed in 1939 when Jim Simmons, Alaska Air Transport, and Alex Holden's Marine Airways of Juneau merged. Most residents in Southeast Alaska know the name Simmons from Shell Simmons Drive, the street name of the contemporary Juneau International Airport. Several Haines residents worked for Alaska Coastal Airlines in the 40s and 50s. Fred Sheldon, brother of the two women who founded our museum, flew as a pilot for ACA until he was killed in a crash in the 1950s. Pictured here is an Alaska Coastal Airlines handbag, flight bag, circa 1960, that was owned by the Sheldon family. It is overladen with many tags, many of which bear the ACA logo. And this was, again, a typical way in the 50s and 60s. You would have this flight bag that would go with you on a plane. In 1941, the Haines Airfield and Runway were constructed. And they were constructed by the U.S. War Department up the Chilkat River on land obtained from the Presbyterian Church. Originally, this was the site of the Chilkat village of Yendastucky, and which was which was famously known as the 1879 meeting place between John Muir, S. Hall Young, and the Chilkat chiefs. It was actually a Chilkoot clan village, but it was the meeting place. It was the gateway into the Chilkat territory. The site is seen, this is 1900 view of Yendastucky here on the left, and then this is the 1940s airport there, shortly after it was built. After the airfield was built, it caused first-time passengers consternation. The planes would take off from the water in Juneau and land on the ground in Haines. And as I said, the Grumman Gooses were good at doing that. During and immediately following World War II, it was the Bush pilots that kept Haines in touch with the world. As yet, there were no scheduled airlines into small communities such as ours. Soon the traffic, and especially the mail contracts, shifted to planes and regular scheduled service began. After the war, with a growing fleet of war surplus Grumman Goose aircraft, Alaska Coastal Airlines and separate Ellis Airlines, based in Ketchikan, prospered and served Southeast Alaska. In Haines, a once-a-month freight barge meant fresh produce was a rare luxury. Adventurous merchants began to fly produce and other perishables, such as cottage cheese, to Haines. Air freight was 30 cents per pound, making airborne lettuce expensive, and therefore you only ate small portions of it. This is an image from the 1940s at the Haines airstrip with people disembarking. And here I'm going to show you a few more images of the Haines airstrip. This is a Grumman Goose landing on the airstrip in the 1950s. And this next image is taken also in the 1950s, showing a car coming to meet passengers and being right next to the plane. This was from the scrapbook of Isabel Miller, who worked at Haines House. In 1962, Alaska Coastal Airlines merged with Ketchikan-based Ellis Airlines to form Alaska Coastal Ellis, the largest scheduled airline exclusively operating amphibians. This photo shows a plane landing at the Haines airstrip in the mid-1960s bearing the Coastal Ellis name. A few years later, in 1968, Alaska Coastal Ellis merged again and became part of Alaska Airlines. Thank you for listening. This was History Tidbit number 17, Flying in the Chilkat Valley. You can find educational resources, such as an air travel-themed Color the Collection mini coloring book, at sheldonmuseum.org/special-events. And we hope you'll join us on Friday when we do History Tidbit number 18 about the Haines Strawberry Festival. So get your taste buds ready, and we'll be discussing strawberries, the Strawberry Festival, and hopefully how you can find some Amway strawberries for your own garden. Thank you.